Grayson Pierce stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, watching the city lights flicker in the gathering dusk. His reflection stared back at him, perfectly tailored suit, silver hair, and eyes that had forgotten how to smile. The whiskey in his crystal glass caught the light, reminding him of another drink, another night 5 years ago. "Mr. Pierce," his assistant's voice crackled through the intercom, "the board meeting is starting in 5 minutes. Grayson didn't respond. His mind was stuck on the photograph he'd found that morning while searching through his desk for contracts. Leo at his high school graduation, trying to smile for the camera, but unable to hide the disappointment in his eyes. Grayson hadn't attended the ceremony. He'd been closing a merger in Tokyo. "Just another sacrifice for your future," he'd told Leo over the phone. "When you take over the company someday, you'll understand." But Leo never got the chance to understand, because 3 months later, he walked out of their lives with nothing but a backpack and words that still haunted Grayson's dreams. "You don't have a son," Leo had said, standing in the marble foyer of their mansion. "You have an heir, and I don't. I want to be either anymore." Martha, their housekeeper who'd practically raised Leo, had been crying. "Young master, please don't go. Your father, he loves you. He just doesn't know how to show it." But Leo had just shaken his head, hugged Martha goodbye, and walked out into the night. Grayson had let him go. He'd convinced himself it was just a phase, that Leo would come back when he ran out of money or realized how hard the real world could be. He'd had his security team track Leo to the bus station, watched through their reports as his son bought a ticket to Chicago. "Let him have his tantrum," Grayson had told his worried board members. "He'll be back." But Leo never came back, and he never touched his trust fund, never used his credit cards, never left a trace in the financial system that Grayson knew so well. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. The first year, Grayson hired private investigators. They tracked Leo to Chicago, then lost him. Found him working at a diner in Detroit, then lost him again. Glimpses and whispers, but never enough to bring him home. The second year, Grayson threw himself into work. He built taller buildings, signed bigger deals, added more zeros to his bank account, as if somehow becoming even richer would fill the ET hole his son had left behind. The third year, he started drinking more. Not enough to affect his work, never that, but enough to help him sleep at night without seeing Leo's face, hearing his last words. The fourth year, he stopped looking at the reports his investigators sent. Stopped hoping every phone call might be Leo. Stopped visiting his son's untouched bedroom in the mansion's east wing. And now, in the fifth year, he stood in his office, holding a photograph and wondering where it had all gone wrong. "Mr. Pierce?" The intercom crackled again. "The board is waiting." Grayson set down his glass and straightened his tie. He was good at this part, being the ruthless businessman, the deal maker, the man who could buy and sell companies like other people bought groceries. It was being a father he'd failed at. The board meeting dragged on for hours. Acquisitions, mergers, profit margins, all the things that had seemed so important when Leo was growing up. All the things that had cost him his son. It was nearly midnight when Grayson finally left his office. The night was cold, a light rain falling on the empty streets. His driver had gone home hours ago, but Grayson didn't mind. Sometimes walking helped clear his head. He cut through the alley behind his building, a shortcut to where he'd parked his car. The smell of garbage and rain filled the air, and his Italian leather shoes splashed through puddles. That's when he saw it. A figure huddled against a dumpster, covered in torn blankets. Just another homeless person in a city full of them. Grayson usually walked past such sights without a second glance, but something made him stop. Maybe it was the way the figure was curled up, knees drawn to chest, the same way Leo used to sleep when he was little. Maybe it was the guilt that had been eating at him all day since finding that photograph. Grayson took a step closer. The figure didn't move. "Hey," he called out softly. "Are you all right?" The bundle of blankets stirred. A face emerged, thin, pale, with a scraggly beard. Eyes that were sunken and tired looked up at him. Grayson's heart stopped. Those eyes. He knew those eyes. Leo. The name escaped. His lips before he could stop it. The figure flinched, then looked closer. "Dad?" The voice was different, rougher, older, but Grayson would know it anywhere. It was the voice that used to call him Daddy and beg for bedtime stories. The voice that had shouted, "I hate you," during countless teenage arguments. The voice that had said goodbye 5 years ago. Grayson fell to his knees, not caring about the wet pavement or his $1,000 suit. His hands reached out, trembling, to touch his son's face. "Leo," he whispered again. "My boy." Leo tried to pull away, but he was too weak. His skin was burning with fever under Grayson's touch. "What are you doing here?" Leo's words slurred slightly. "Come to check on your investment?" The bitterness in his voice cut deep, but Grayson didn't let go. "You're sick. You need a doctor." "I don't need anything from you." Leo tried to stand, but swayed dangerously. "I've been fine on my own." "Fine?" Grayson looked at his son, really looked at him. The hollow cheeks, the dirty clothes, the way his hands shook. "This is what you call fine?" "At least I'm free," Leo muttered. But his eyes were glazing over, his body trembling harder. "Free from your money, your expectations, your—" He never finished the sentence. His eyes rolled back and he collapsed into Grayson's arms. "Leo!" Grayson caught him, feeling how light his son had become, how fragile. "Stay with me, son. Please." With shaking fingers, he pulled out his phone and dialed 911. As he held his unconscious son and waited for the ambulance, the rain fell harder, washing away 5 years of pride and stubbornness. "I'm sorry," he whispered into Leo's matted hair. "I'm so sorry. Please don't leave me again." But Leo couldn't hear him, and as sirens wailed in the distance, Grayson Pierce, the man who had everything, realized he might lose the only thing that truly mattered. Again, the emergency room at Mount Sinai Hospital was chaos. Doctors rushed past, nurses called out orders, and machines beeped endlessly. But Grayson Pierce heard none of it. His eyes were fixed on the double doors they'd wheeled Leo through 20 minutes ago. "Sir?" A nurse touched his arm. "I need you to fill out these forms." Grayson took the clipboard with trembling hands. Such a simple thing, writing his son's name, date of birth, medical history, but he realized with a stab of pain that he didn't know if Leo had any allergies now, or what medications he might be taking. "I don't—" His voice cracked. "I haven't seen him in 5 years." The nurse's face softened. "Just fill out what you know, Mr. Pierce." Of course she recognized him. Everyone in New York knew Grayson Pierce, the billionaire businessman, the man whose face was on magazine covers, the man who owned half the buildings in Manhattan, the man who had lost his own son. Martha arrived an hour later, her gray hair still in curlers, wearing the same housekeeper's uniform she'd worn for 20 years. "I came as soon as you called," she said, hugging Grayson. "How is he?" "They won't tell me anything." Grayson's voice was rough. "I'm his father, but I feel like a stranger." Martha squeezed his hand. She was the only one who'd never judged him after Leo left. The only one who'd seen him cry that first Christmas without his son. "You found him," she said softly. "That's what matters now." The doctor finally emerged after what felt like hours. "Mr. Pierce?" Grayson stood so quickly he got dizzy. "How is he?" "Your son is severely malnourished and has a serious case of pneumonia. We've started him on antibiotics and fluids. He's also showing signs of substance abuse." "No." Grayson shook his head. "Not Leo. He never even drank in high school." "Mr. Pierce," the doctor's voice was gentle but firm. "A lot can change in 5 years on the streets. We found track marks on his arms." The words hit Grayson like physical blows. His son, his bright, ambitious boy who'd wanted to save the world, sleeping in alleys, shooting drugs into his veins. "Can I see him?" The doctor nodded. "He's sedated, but you can sit with him." Room 412 was quiet, except for the steady beep of monitors. Leo lay in the hospital bed, looking small and broken. They'd cleaned him up, shaved his beard, but it only made the hollows in his cheeks more obvious. Grayson sank into the chair beside the bed. Under the harsh fluorescent lights, he could see every mark the streets had left on his son. The scars on his arms, the badly healed break in his nose, the way his collarbone stuck out sharp against his skin. "What happened to you?" he whispered, taking Leo's hand. It was so cold. "What made you choose this over home?" "He chose freedom," a voice said from the doorway. Grayson turned to see a young woman standing there. She had bright pink hair and wore ripped jeans with a nurse's scrubs top. "Who are you?" "I'm Sarah. I work at the shelter on 9th Street. She stepped into the room. "Leo stays there sometimes when it's really cold." Grayson's throat tightened. A shelter. His son had been sleeping in homeless shelters while he lived in a 30-room mansion. "Do you know him well?" Sarah's eyes softened. "He talks about you sometimes when he's having a rough night." "What does he say?" "That he misses his dad, the one who used to read him bedtime stories and take him fishing." She paused. "Not the one who replaced him with spreadsheets and board." "Meetings." The word struck home with painful accuracy. Grayson looked at his sleeping son, remembering those fishing trips. How Leo's face would light up when he caught something. How proud he'd been to show his father. When was the last time they'd done anything like that? "He tried really hard, you know," Sarah continued. "Got clean twice, found jobs, but something always pulled him back down." She met Grayson's eyes. "He never used your name, never asked for help. Said he had to prove he could make it on his own pride." The same stubborn pride that had kept Grayson from running after his son that night. The same pride that had ruined both their lives. "I can give him the best treatment," Grayson said. "Private doctors, rehab facilities. That's not what he needs." Sarah's voice was kind but firm. "He needs his father, not his bank account." She left then, leaving Grayson alone with the truth he'd been avoiding for 5 years. Money couldn't fix this. All his billions couldn't buy back the time he'd lost, couldn't heal the wounds he'd caused. Martha came in later with coffee and a change of clothes for Grayson. She took one look at Leo and burst into tears. "My poor baby," she whispered, stroking his hair like she used to when he was sick as a child. "What did they do to you?" "I did this," Grayson said quietly. "I drove him to this." Martha turned to him sharply. "Now you listen to me, Grayson Pierce. You made mistakes, big ones. But you didn't put that needle in his arm. You didn't make him live on the streets. He made choices too. Because of me. Because he's just as stubborn as you." She took his hand. "The question is, what are you going to do now?" Before Grayson could answer, Leo stirred. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then sharpening as he took in his surroundings. "No," he tried to sit up. "No hospitals. I can't, Leo, please." Grayson reached for him, but Leo flinched away. "I don't want your help." But the words dissolved into a coughing fit that left him gasping. Martha rushed to get a nurse while Grayson watched helplessly as his son struggled to breathe. "You can hate me," he said, when Leo's coughs finally subsided. "You can never speak to me again after this. But please, let us help you get well." Leo stared at him for a long moment. He looked so tired, so much older than his 23 years. "Why?" His voice was barely a whisper. "Why now?" "Because I'm an embarrassment. Afraid I'll ruin the family." "Name?" "Because you're my son." Grayson's voice broke. "And I love you. I've always loved you. I just forgot how to show it." Leo closed his eyes, a tear sliding down his cheek. "It's too late." "No." Grayson gripped the bed rail. "It's not too late. I'll prove it to you. Whatever it takes." The nurse came in then with more medication, and Leo drifted back to sleep. But his last words hung in the air, a challenge and a chance. Grayson looked at his son's sleeping face and made a silent vow. He'd spent his life building an empire of steel and glass. Now it was time to rebuild something far more precious. His family. News travels fast in New York, especially when it involves the rich and powerful. By morning, reporters crowded the hospital entrance, their cameras flashing like lightning. "Pierce heir found homeless," screamed the headlines. "Billionaire's son from penthouse to streets." Inside the hospital, Grayson sat in Leo's room watching his son sleep. The TV mounted on the wall was muted, but he could see his own face on the morning news. Below it, photos of Leo from his teenage years. Class president, debate team captain, the boy who had everything. "Turn it off," Leo mumbled, opening his eyes. "I don't want to see that." Grayson quickly grabbed the remote. "How are you feeling?" "Like I got hit by a truck." Leo's voice was hoarse. "Where are my clothes?" "The doctors had to cut them off. They were soaked and I need to leave." Leo tried to sit up, but the movement sent him into another coughing fit. You're not going anywhere. Grayson put a firm hand on his shoulder. You have pneumonia, Leo, and the doctors found... Don't. Leo's eyes hardened. Don't pretend you care now. I've always cared. Really? Leo laughed, but it turned into a wheeze. Where were you when I broke my arm in 10th grade? Oh, right. In Dubai. Closing a deal. When I won the state debate championship. London. My graduation. Tokyo. Each. Word was like a knife to Grayson's heart, because they were all true. I thought I was providing for your future, he said quietly, making sure you'd have everything I didn't have growing up. I didn't want everything. Leo's voice cracked. I just wanted my dad. Before Grayson could respond, the door opened. A tall man in an expensive suit walked in, followed by two others carrying briefcases. Mr. Pierce, the man said, I'm Richard Maxwell, head of PR for Pierce Enterprises. We need to discuss damage control. Leo's face went blank, the mask of indifference he'd perfected as a teenager sliding back into place. Get out, Grayson said. Maxwell blinked. Sir, the board is very concerned about... Get out. Grayson stood, his voice dropping to the dangerous tone that had made him famous in boardrooms. If anyone from the company comes near this room without my express permission, they're fired. Understood. The PR team practically ran from the room. When Grayson turned back, Leo was watching him with an unreadable expression. The great Grayson Pierce choosing family over business? Leo's voice dripped sarcasm. Alert the media. Oh, wait. They're already here. I deserve that, Grayson said quietly. I deserve all of it. But right now you need to focus on getting better. So I can what? Come back to the mansion. Play the prodigal son. Sorry, but I don't fit in your perfect world anymore. As if to emphasize his point, Leo's hands started shaking, the first signs of withdrawal. He curled them into fists, but Grayson had already seen. We can get you help, he said softly. The best rehab facilities. I don't want your money, Leo shouted, then doubled over coughing. Martha rushed in, drawn by the noise. What's going on here? Nothing, Leo gasped between coughs. I'm leaving. Like hell you are. Martha's tone was the same one she'd used when Leo tried to skip school as a kid. You're sick, young man. And if you think I'm letting you walk out that door, you've lost your mind. Leo slumped back against the pillows, too weak to argue. Martha adjusted his blankets with practiced hands. Now both of you listen to me, she said firmly. You're both stubborn fools, and you're both hurting. But this fighting isn't helping anyone. She turned to Grayson. You need to stop throwing money at the problem and start listening to your son, then to Leo. And you need to stop punishing your father and yourself. Look where it's got you. Neither man spoke. Martha sighed and pulled out her phone. Who are you calling? Grayson asked. Sarah from the shelter. Leo trusts her, and right now that's what we need. Leo's eyes widened. You know Sarah? She's been here, Grayson said. She cares about you. Something flickered in Leo's eyes. Hope, maybe, or fear. Did she tell you everything? She told me enough. Grayson sat down again. About how you tried to get clean, how you never used my name or money. Leo looked away. I wanted to prove I could make it on my own, and nearly killed yourself doing it. Martha's voice was gentle but firm. Sometimes asking for help isn't weakness, baby. It's strength. A nurse came in with Leo's morning medication. As she checked his vitals, Grayson noticed his son's hands were shaking harder. The withdrawal is starting, the nurse said quietly. It's going to get rough. Leo closed his eyes, shame written across his face. Just let me leave, please. I can't do this with you watching. I'm not going anywhere, Grayson said. You don't have to talk to me. You don't even have to look at me. But I'm staying. Why? Leo's voice was small, almost childlike. Why now? Because 5 years ago I let you walk away, and it was the biggest mistake of my life. Grayson took his son's trembling hand. I'm not making that mistake again. Sarah arrived an hour later, her pink hair clashing with the hospital's sterile walls. She took one look at Leo and pulled a worn notebook from her bag. Your journal, she said, placing it on his bedside table. You left it at the shelter last week. Leo stared at the notebook like it was a lifeline. Did you? I didn't read it, she smiled. But maybe you should share it with your dad when you're ready. The day wore on. Leo's withdrawal symptoms got worse. Sweating, shaking, nausea. He curled into a ball on the bed, refusing to let anyone touch him. Grayson stayed, watching helplessly as his son fought battles he couldn't fight for him. Martha brought coffee and sandwiches that no one ate. Sarah sat in the corner, her presence somehow making the room less tense. As night fell, Leo finally spoke again, his voice raw. "I never wanted to be like this," he whispered. "I had dreams, plans." "You still can," Grayson said. "It's not too late." Leo turned to look at him, really look at him, for the first time in 5 years. "How do you know?" "Because you're my son." Grayson's voice was firm. "And Pierce men don't give up, even when we should." A ghost of a smile crossed Leo's face. "Is that your way of admitting you're stubborn?" "Maybe." Grayson smiled back, and for a moment the years between them felt a little less vast. Then Leo's body seized with another wave of withdrawal and the moment shattered. But this time, when Grayson reached for his hand, Leo didn't pull away. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't even acceptance. But it was a start. Outside the hospital, reporters still waited with their cameras. The board of Pierce Enterprises was probably having fits. The business empire Grayson had built might even be shaking, but for the first time in 5 years, none of that mattered. Because in room 412, a father was finally learning what it meant to be rich. The next few days brought more challenges than Grayson had expected. His phone wouldn't stop ringing with calls from board members, shareholders, and reporters. Everyone wanted to know about Leo, about the drugs, about why the mighty Grayson Pierce had let his only son end up on the streets. "Sir," his secretary Angela said, bringing yet another stack of messages into the hospital room, "the board is demanding an emergency meeting. They're talking about a vote of no confidence." Grayson barely looked up from where he sat beside Leo's bed. "Let them vote." "But sir, your position as CEO, my son is more important." Leo, who'd been pretending to sleep, opened his eyes. "Don't be stupid, go to your meeting." "I'm not leaving you, I don't need a babysitter." Leo's voice was sharp, but his hands were shaking again. The withdrawal symptoms came in waves, leaving him alternately angry and desperate. "I'm not going anywhere. Too weak to run, remember?" Before Grayson could respond, another visitor arrived. Victor Chen, his oldest friend and the company's chief financial officer, stood in the doorway looking grave. "Gray, we need to talk, now." Something in Victor's tone made Grayson follow him into the hallway. They'd known each other since college, roommates who'd built Pierce Enterprises from the ground up. "The vultures are circling," Victor said without preamble. "Davidson Tech made an offer this morning. They want to buy us out." Grayson's head snapped up. "What?" "They're using this scandal to their advantage. Our stock is dropping. Shareholders are nervous. If you don't come to this meeting, we might not have a company left to save." Inside the room, they could hear Leo coughing. The sound tore at Grayson's heart. "I can't leave him, Vic, not again." "Then bring him with you." Both men turned to see Sarah standing there, her pink hair pulled back in a professional bun. She'd traded her usual ripped jeans for slacks and a blazer. "The doctors say he's stable enough to move," she continued. "And the hospital's not the best place for him now anyway. Too many reporters sneaking in as orderlies." "He needs medical care," Grayson protested. "I've arranged everything with New Hope Recovery Center," Sarah said. "It's the best rehab facility in the state, and it's only 10 minutes from your office." Victor nodded approvingly. "You could visit between meetings, show the board you're handling. Both situations." "And what about what Leo wants?" Grayson asked. "He doesn't trust me. He'll think I'm trying to control him again." "Then let me talk to him." Sarah's voice was firm. "He knows I wouldn't suggest this if it wasn't the best option." Inside the room, Leo was arguing with Martha about eating his lunch. "I'm not hungry," he muttered, pushing away the soup. "You're skin and bones," Martha scolded. "How do you expect to get better if you don't eat?" Sarah cleared her throat. "Leo, can we talk?" His face brightened slightly at seeing her, then darkened when he noticed her outfit. "What's with the corporate look?" "I clean up nice, don't I?" She sat on the edge of his bed. "Listen, we need to discuss next steps." Leo's expression closed off. "I told you I'm not going to some fancy rehab. New Hope isn't fancy, it's good, real good. They actually help people, not just hide them away." She took his hand. And you know you need help. I can do it on my own. Like you have been. Her voice was gentle but firm. How's that working out? Leo looked away, but not before they saw the tears in his eyes. I'm scared, he whispered. Sarah squeezed his hand. I know, but you're not alone anymore. My father has a company to run, Leo said bitterly. He can't babysit me forever. No, Grayson spoke up from the doorway. But I can visit every day. Between meetings, after work, whenever you need me. Until the next big deal comes along, Leo's voice cracked. Until something more important, nothing is more important than you. Grayson crossed the room in 3 strides. Nothing, not the company, not the money, nothing. For you say that now, because I finally understand what I've been too blind to see. Grayson knelt beside the bed. I thought I was building an empire for you. But what good is an empire if I lose my son? The room fell silent. Even Martha stopped, fussing with the lunch tray. Finally, Leo spoke, his voice small. What if I fail? What if I can't get clean? Then we'll try again. Grayson took his son's trembling hand. As many times as it takes. The press will have a field day. Let them. I don't care anymore. Leo studied his father's face, looking for any sign of deception. You really mean that, don't you? With all my heart, Sarah smiled. So, should I call New Hope? Leo took a deep breath, then nodded. Okay, but I have conditions. Anything, Grayson said quickly. I don't want special treatment. No private wing, no extra privileges. I do this like anyone else would. Done. And, Leo hesitated, I want to read my journal to you, parts of it anyway, so you understand everything. Grayson's throat tightened. I'd like that. Victor, who'd been quietly watching from the doorway, stepped forward. I hate to interrupt, but Gray, the board meeting. Right. Grayson stood. I'll go handle this Davidson Tech situation, then I'll be back to help with the transfer to New Hope. Davidson Tech. Leo sat up straighter. Michael Davidson's company. Something in his tone made everyone look at him. You know Michael Davidson? Victor asked. Leo's face had gone pale. You could say that. He's the one who found me 6 months after I left, offered me a job. He laughed bitterly. Said he wanted to help the prodigal son make his own way. But you didn't take it, Grayson said slowly. I did, actually, for almost a year. Leo's hands were shaking again, but not from withdrawal, until I found out what he really wanted, which was inside. Information about Pierce, enterprises, access to your private servers, anything he could use against you. Leo looked at his father. When I refused, things got ugly. Victor swore under his breath. He's been planning this for years. Using my own son against me. Grayson's voice was deadly quiet. That's why you ended up on the streets? Because of Davidson? Part of it. Leo wouldn't meet his eyes. The drugs, that came later, after. He trailed off, but the implication was clear. Whatever Davidson had done had helped push Leo into his downward spiral. Grayson's hands clenched into fists. The businessman in him wanted to rush to that board meeting, to crush Davidson's takeover attempt. But the father in him couldn't leave his son, not when he was finally opening up. Sarah, sensing his dilemma, spoke up. Why don't we get Leo settled at New Hope first? Then you can deal with Davidson. He's probably counting on you being distracted, Victor added, using Leo's situation to push through this buyout. He's going to regret that, Grayson said softly. Then to Leo. Are you sure you're okay with going to New Hope? We can wait. No. Leo's voice was stronger now. I need to do this, and you need to save the company. He managed a weak smile. Just come back this time? Wild horses couldn't keep me away. Grayson hugged his son, feeling how fragile he'd become. We're going to fix everything, Leo, I promise. As they prepared for Leo's transfer to New Hope, Grayson's mind was already planning. Michael Davidson had tried to use his son as a weapon, had helped drive Leo to the streets, to drugs. That was a mistake Davidson would live to regret, because Grayson Pierce wasn't just a businessman anymore. He was a father, and nobody hurt his son. New Hope Recovery Center looked nothing like what Leo had expected. Instead of the luxury spa-like facility he'd feared, it was a modest 3-story building surrounded by gardens. The walls were painted in soft blues and greens, and the staff wore casual clothes instead of starched uniforms. "This is your room," Sarah said, showing him a simple space with 2 beds. "You'll have a roommate. His name's Tony. He's been here 3 months. Leo sat on the bed, clutching his journal. "No private room? You said you wanted to be treated like everyone else." Sarah smiled. "This is what everyone else gets." Meanwhile, across town, Grayson Pierce walked into the Pierce Enterprises boardroom like a storm about to break. The board members who'd been chatting amongst themselves fell silent. "So," Grayson said quietly, "I hear Michael Davidson wants to buy my company." Richard Maxwell, the PR head, cleared his throat. "Sir, given the current situation with your son," "My son," Grayson cut him off, "was targeted by Davidson years ago. Used and manipulated when he was barely 18, and now Davidson thinks he can use Leo's struggles to steal this company." He smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "I don't think so." Victor Chen started passing out folders. "We've been doing some digging. Davidson Tech's offer looks good on paper, but look at page 3. The board members flipped through their folders, murmuring as they read. "They're leveraged to the hilt," Victor explained. "Davidson's betting everything on this takeover. If it fails, his company goes under," Grayson finished. "He's desperate, and desperate men make mistakes." Back at New Hope, Leo was meeting his roommate. Tony was a former construction worker with tattoos and a kind smile. "First day's the hardest," Tony said, watching Leo unpack his few belongings. "Second day too, actually. They all kind of suck at first." Leo managed a weak laugh. "Thanks for the pep talk. Just being honest, rich boy." But Tony's voice was friendly. "Everyone's the same in here. We're all just trying to get better." The day passed in a blur of intake interviews, medical checks, and orientation meetings. Leo learned the schedule: wake up at 7, breakfast at 8, group therapy at 9, one-on-one counseling, lunch, activities, more therapy. Structure helps, his counselor, Dr. Rodriguez, explained. It gives you something to focus on besides the cravings. By evening, Leo was exhausted. His hands wouldn't stop shaking, and every bone in his body ached. He sat in the garden, trying to find peace in the fading sunlight. "Rough first day?" he turned to. See Grayson walking toward him, suit jacket slung over his shoulder, tie loosened. "You came," Leo said, surprised. "I promised, didn't I?" Grayson sat beside him on the bench. "How are you holding up?" "Been better." Leo wrapped his arms around himself. "The board meeting can wait. Tell me about your day." So Leo did. He told his father about Tony, about Dr. Rodriguez, about the garden where residents could grow their own vegetables. "It's not what I expected," he admitted. "Is that good or bad?" "Good, I think." Leo hesitated. "Dad, about Davidson." Grayson's face hardened. "Don't worry about him, but I should have told you sooner about what he did." Leo, look at me." Grayson turned to face his son. "What Davidson did to you, that's on him, not you. You were barely an adult trying to make it on your own. He took advantage of that." "He said," Leo's voice cracked, "he said you'd never believe me, that you'd think I was just making excuses. I believe you." Grayson's voice was fierce. "And I'm going to make him pay for every second of pain he caused you." Inside the building, the evening group session was starting. Leo could hear the muffled sounds of chairs being arranged. "I should go," he said reluctantly. "I'll come back tomorrow." Grayson stood, then hesitated. "Unless you don't want—" "I want." Leo surprised himself with how quickly he answered. Maybe I could read you some of my journal." "I'd like that." As Leo walked to group therapy, he felt something he hadn't felt in years: hope. The next morning, Grayson sat in his office reviewing the files Victor had compiled on Davidson Tech. The more he read, the clearer the picture became. "He's been planning this for years," Victor said, pacing the office, "using shell companies to buy up our stock, gathering intel on our operations, and using my son to do it." Grayson's voice was cold. "That's why he approached Leo first. He knew a teenage runaway would be vulnerable. What do you want to do?" Grayson looked at the photo on his desk. Leo at 13, grinning after winning his first debate competition. "I want to destroy him. The board might not approve. The board works for me, not the other way around." Grayson stood. "Call everyone." Ken, it's time they learned what kind of man Michael Davidson really is. At New Hope, Leo was in his first group therapy session. The circle of chairs held people from all walks of life. A teacher, a lawyer, a college student, a grandmother. "Everyone here has a story," Dr. Rodriguez said. "Would you like to share yours, Leo?" Leo gripped his journal tightly. I don't know where to start." "Start with the truth," Tony said from across the circle. "That's what we do here." So Leo opened his journal and began to read. "5 years ago, I walked away from everything I knew. I thought I was escaping a prison of expectations and obligations. I didn't realize I was walking into a different kind of prison." The words poured out. His anger at his father, his desire to prove himself, meeting Davidson, the manipulation, the threats, the spiral into addiction. When he finished, there was silence. Then the grandmother reached over and squeezed his hand. "You're not alone anymore, honey. Back at Pierce Enterprises, the boardroom was in chaos. 'This is madness,' Maxwell shouted. 'You can't just declare war on Davidson Tech.' Watch me." Grayson's voice cut through the noise. "He used my son, tried to destroy him. Now he wants my company?" He slammed his hand on the table. "I built this company from nothing, sacrificed everything for it, including my relationship with my son. And that stops now." He looked around the room, meeting each board member's eyes. "How you all have a choice to make. Stand with me and we'll not only save this company, we'll make it stronger. Stand against me." He shrugged. "Well, I hear Davidson's looking for new board members." One by one, the board members nodded. Even Maxwell fell silent. Victor smiled. "What's the plan, Gray?" "First, we gather every piece of evidence Leo has about Davidson's manipulation. Then we go through every deal Davidson Tech has made in the last 5 years. Every contract, every acquisition. That could take weeks. Then we better start now." Grayson checked his watch. "But first, I have somewhere to be." At New Hope, Leo was waiting in the garden. His hands were steadier today, but the cravings were still there, a constant ache under his skin. "Hard day?" Grayson asked, sitting down. Leo nodded. "Group therapy. I told them everything." "That took courage. Does it?" Leo looked at his hands. "Sometimes I feel like a coward, running away, turning to drugs. You were hurt and alone." Grayson's voice was gentle. "But you're not alone anymore." Leo opened his journal. "There's something I want to read you. From the day Davidson first approached me. As the sun set over New Hope's gardens, father and son began to rebuild what had been broken. And across town, the first moves in a different kind of war were being made, because sometimes healing means facing the past, and sometimes it means fighting back." 2 weeks passed at New Hope. Leo's hands had stopped shaking, but the real battle was only beginning. Every morning brought new challenges, new demons to face. "Tell us about the moment you hit rock bottom," Dr. Rodriguez said during group therapy. Leo looked around the circle. Tony was there, steady as always. Maria, the grandmother who'd held his hand that first day. Jake, the college student who'd lost his scholarship to addiction. "I thought I'd hit bottom lots of times," Leo said slowly. "Living on the streets, selling everything I owned for drugs. But real rock bottom?" He opened his journal. "It was 3 months ago." The room fell silent as he read. "I saw my father today. He didn't see me. He was leaving his office building, talking on his phone, looking exactly the same as the day I left. I was digging through the dumpster behind his building, looking for anything I could sell. I wanted him to see me, wanted him to be horrified, disgusted, wanted him to feel as broken as I felt. But he walked right past, and I realized I didn't want him to see me at all, because then he'd know that his son had become nothing." Leo's voice cracked. "That's when I knew how far I'd fallen. Not because I was homeless or addicted, but because I'd let hate consume me so much that I wanted my own father to suffer." Across town, Grayson sat in his office, reading a different kind of revelation. Victor had just dropped a thick file on His desk. We found it, Victor said grimly. Everything Davidson did to Leo, and he wasn't the only one. Grayson opened the file. Inside were statements, emails, bank records, a pattern of Davidson targeting vulnerable young people from wealthy families, offering them jobs, then using them to gather information about their families' businesses. Some of them ended up like Leo, Victor continued, on the streets, addicted. Others took their own lives. Davidson covered it all up with NDAs and payoffs. Grayson's hands shook with rage. Get me a meeting with him. Gray, maybe we should get me a meeting. At New Hope, Leo was having his one-on-one session with Dr. Rodriguez. You've been here 2 weeks, she said. How do you feel about your father's daily visits? Leo stared out the window at the garden. Part of me keeps waiting for him to stop coming, to find some business deal more important than his junkie son. Has he missed a single visit? No. Leo smiled slightly. He even rescheduled a board meeting yesterday because it conflicted with our time. And how does that make you feel? Scared. Leo's voice was barely a whisper. Because what if this is real? What if he really has changed? Then all those years of hating him, of blaming him for everything, would mean you have to face your own choices? Leo nodded, tears in his eyes. The next day, Michael Davidson walked into Pierce Enterprises like he owned it already. His expensive suit and smug smile radiated confidence. Grayson, he said smoothly, finally ready to discuss my offer. Grayson didn't stand to greet him, didn't offer his hand, just gestured to the chair across from his desk. Tell me, Michael, how's the recruitment program at Davidson Tech? Davidson's smile flickered. I'm not sure what you mean. No? Grayson opened the file on his desk. Let me refresh your memory. 5 years ago, you approached my son, 18 years old, angry at his father, perfect target, just like Thomas. Wheeler's daughter, and James Morton's son, and at least 6 others. The color drained from Davidson's face. You really should have checked those NDAs more carefully, Grayson continued. Amazing what people will tell you when they learn they're not the only victims. Now listen here. No, you listen. Grayson's voice could have frozen fire. You hurt my son. Used him. Helped drive him to the streets, to drugs. And then you tried to use his pain to steal my company. Davidson stood. You can't prove anything. Want to bet? Grayson pressed a button on his phone. Victor? The door opened. Victor walked in, followed by 3 people Davidson clearly recognized. Thomas Wheeler, James Morton, and Sarah, still in her professional clothes. Remember me? Sarah's voice was cold. I wasn't just some shelter worker who helped Leo. I was gathering evidence, building a case, because Leo wasn't the only one who needed justice. Davidson lunged for the door, but security was already there. You have 2 choices, Grayson said calmly. Sign over controlling interest in Davidson Tech to my company, at a price I set, or face criminal charges. The FBI is very interested in your recruiting methods. You're bluffing. Try me. Grayson stood. You tried to destroy my son to get my company. Now I'm going to take your company to save my son. Seems fair, doesn't it? At New Hope, Leo was in the garden with Tony, working on their vegetable plot. Your dad's coming today? Tony asked, digging a hole for a tomato plant. Should be here. Soon? Leo checked his watch. Unless something came up at work. Leo. He turned to see his father walking toward them, suit dusty, tie askew, but smiling. Dad? You're early. Had an interesting meeting today. Grayson sat on their usual bench, with Michael Davidson. Leo's hands froze in the dirt. What? We found everything, son, the others he hurt, the whole operation. Grayson's voice softened. Why didn't you tell me how bad it was? Leo couldn't meet his eyes. I was ashamed. He made me feel so stupid. Said I was just a spoiled, rich kid playing at independence, that no one would believe me over him. I believe you. Grayson reached out, not caring that Leo's hands were covered in garden soil, and so do his other victims. Sarah helped us find them. Sarah? Leo looked up, surprised. She was investigating him? For 2 years, she was working with a victims' advocacy group. Grayson squeezed his son's hands. Davidson's finished, Leo. He'll never hurt anyone again. Leo's eyes filled with tears. I thought it was all my fault. Being weak, letting him manipulate me. No, Grayson's voice was fierce. You were young and hurt and he took advantage of that. But you survived. You're getting better, and I've never been prouder of you. Tony, who'd been quietly working nearby, spoke up. Sounds like your dad kicked some serious butt today. Leo laughed through his tears. Yeah, he did. Good. Tony nodded. Now both of you can help me plant these tomatoes. Even fancy businessmen can get their hands dirty sometimes, right? To Leo's surprise, Grayson took off his suit jacket and rolled up his sleeves. Show me what to do. As they worked in the garden. Together, Leo felt something shift inside him. The hate and anger that had driven him for 5 years began to crack, letting in something new. Forgiveness, not just for his father, but for himself. Later, as the sun set, Leo opened his journal to a fresh page and began to write. Today I learned that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is let go. Let go of hate, let go of blame, let go of the person you thought you had to be. He looked up at his father, who was still trying to get dirt off his Italian leather shoes. And sometimes, he wrote, the people you thought were lost forever find their way back to you, not because of money or power or revenge, but because of love. What are you writing? Grayson asked. Leo smiled. Our story, the real one, not about business empires or revenge, about a father and son finding their way back to each other. Think it has a happy ending? I don't know yet. Leo closed his journal. But for the first time in 5 years, I think it might. The garden lights came on, signaling evening medication time. Leo stood stronger than he'd been 2 weeks ago, but still fragile, still healing. Same time tomorrow? He asked. Grayson hugged him, not caring. About the garden dirt on their clothes. Try and stop me, because sometimes the biggest victories aren't won in boardrooms. They're won in hospital rooms and rehab centers and quiet gardens where broken things learn to grow again. The news of Michael Davidson's downfall spread through New York like wildfire. Tech mogul exposed, screamed the headlines. Billionaire's plot against rival's son revealed. But in the quiet garden of New Hope Recovery Center, Leo Pierce had more important things to worry about. Today marked 1 month of sobriety, and he was about to face his biggest challenge yet. Family therapy, Dr. Rodriguez announced, gesturing to the chairs in her office. Are you both ready? Leo and Grayson sat down, neither quite looking at the other. They'd spent hours together over the past month, reading Leo's journal, working in the garden, talking about Davidson. But this was different. Leo, Dr. Rodriguez, said gently, why don't you start? Tell your father about the night you left. Leo opened his journal with trembling hands. I've been trying to write about this for weeks. It always comes out angry. He took a deep breath. But maybe that's the problem. Maybe I need to be honest, instead of angry. Grayson sat perfectly still, listening. It wasn't just about you missing. My graduation, Leo began, or the debates or the soccer games, it was about the way you looked at me like I was a project, an investment, something to be molded into the perfect heir. Son, I never... Please, Dr. Rodriguez held up her hand. Let him finish, Leo continued, his voice growing stronger. That night I'd prepared this whole speech about wanting to study literature instead of business, about maybe teaching or writing. But when I walked into your office, you were already talking about my future at the company, about the legacy I'd inherit. He looked up, meeting his father's eyes. And I realized you'd never even asked me what I wanted, not once in 18 years. Grayson's face crumpled. I thought I was giving you everything. Everything except choice. Leo's voice cracked. So I chose for myself. I walked away. And then Davidson found you, Grayson finished quietly. He knew exactly what to say, how to make me feel seen, valued. He asked about my dreams, my plans. Leo laughed bitterly. I was so desperate to prove I could make it without your money that I didn't see what he really wanted. Dr. Rodriguez leaned forward. Grayson, how does hearing this make you feel? Like a fool. Grayson's voice was rough with emotion. I was so busy building an empire for Leo that I didn't see I was losing him. And when he needed me most, when Davidson was destroying his life, I was too blind to see it. You couldn't have known. I should have. Grayson stood, pacing the office. "I'm your father. I should have protected you. Instead, I drove you away and left you vulnerable to men like Davidson." Leo watched his father, seeing not the powerful businessman, but a man broken by regret. "Dad," he said softly, "I need to show you something." He flipped to a newer page in his journal. "I wrote this last week after you took down Davidson. After you chose me over the company. What your father did was very powerful," Dr. Rodriguez noted. "How did it make you feel? Like maybe I'd been wrong too?" Leo began to read. "Today I watched my father plant tomatoes in dirty designer shoes. The man who once refused to miss a board meeting for my graduation spent 3 hours playing in the dirt because I asked him to. And I realized people can change, even billionaires. Even me." Grayson sat back down, tears in his eyes. "The hardest part of recovery," Leo continued reading, "isn't just getting clean. It's facing the truth about yourself. I blamed my father for everything, made him the villain in my story because it was easier than admitting my own mistakes. Easier than facing the fact that I chose drugs over asking for help, chose hate over healing." Dr. Rodriguez smiled encouragingly. "That's a powerful insight, Leo. But here's the thing." Leo looked at his father. "You did make mistakes, big ones. And I made mine. Maybe instead of keeping score, we could just start over." "I'd like that." Grayson's voice was barely a whisper. "But Leo, about your dreams, the writing, teaching, we can talk about that later." Leo managed a small smile. "Right now, I just need to focus on getting better. One day at a time, right?" "Right." Grayson reached for his son's hand. "Together." That evening, after therapy, they sat in their usual spot in the garden. The tomato plants they'd put in were starting to grow, tiny green shoots reaching for the sky. "Sarah called," Grayson said. "The support group for Davidson's victims is starting next week. She thinks your story might help others come forward." Leo stared at the plants. "I'm not ready to talk about it publicly. No one's pushing you. But when you are ready, if you ever are, you won't have to do it alone." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the distant sound of the evening medication call. "You know what I remember?" Grayson said suddenly. "When you were 6, you wrote this story about a dragon who was afraid of fire. Your teacher said it was too imaginative, not practical enough. I told you to focus on math instead." Leo nodded. "I remember. You kept writing, though, in secret. I found your notebooks once, but I never said anything." Grayson looked at his son. "They were good, Leo, really good. That was a long time ago. It's never too late." Grayson gestured to the journal in Leo's lap. "You're still writing, still telling stories. Different kinds of stories now, but still yours." Grayson stood, brushing dirt from his pants. "When you're ready to leave here, when you're stronger, we'll talk about your future. And this time I promise to listen." Inside the building, Tony was watching them through the window. "Your dad's different from what I expected," he told Leo later. "When you first got here, the way you talked about him, he is different." Leo looked down at his journal. "Or maybe I'm seeing him differently, without the anger in the way." "Recovery does that," Tony nodded wisely. "Makes you see things clearer, people too." That night, Leo wrote in his journal one last time. "Today my father and I planted seeds in more ways than one. Some will grow into tomatoes. Others might grow into something harder to see but just as real. Trust, understanding, forgiveness. They take time, these invisible gardens, but for the first time I believe they can bloom." In his office across town, Grayson Pierce sat at his desk, looking at a different kind of paperwork. Not contracts or merger documents, but college brochures, literature programs, teaching certificates. Options he should have considered 5 years ago. He picked up his phone and dialed a familiar number. "Victor, remember that educational foundation we talked about? The one to help addiction survivors go back to school? Let's make it happen. And let's call it the New Hope Foundation. Because sometimes the best way to heal old wounds is to help others heal theirs. And sometimes the greatest business a father can build isn't made of steel and glass. It's built with second chances, forgiveness and love, one day at a time." 2 months into Leo's recovery at New Hope, A familiar face showed up at the front desk. Martha, still in her housekeeper's uniform, clutched her purse nervously as she signed in. "I hope it's okay that—" "I came," she said when Leo met her in the visitors area. "Your father said you were doing better and I had to see for myself." Leo hugged her tight, breathing in the familiar scent of lemon furniture polish and chocolate chip cookies that had always meant home. "I've missed you, Martha." She pulled back, tears in her eyes as she studied his face. "You look better." Still. Too skinny, but better. Before Leo could respond, Tony walked by and did a double take. "Wait, is this the Martha? The cookie Martha?" Leo laughed. "Martha, this is my roommate Tony. I might have mentioned your baking once or twice." "Once or twice?" Tony grinned. "Try every night. Martha's cookies could solve world peace. Martha's cookies could make even group therapy bearable." Martha beamed, pulling a familiar tin from her purse. "Well then, it's a good thing I brought some." But as they sat sharing cookies and memories, Martha's smile faded. "There's something else," she said quietly. "Something your father asked me to tell you." Leo's hand froze halfway to the cookie tin. "What's wrong?" "Rebecca's back in town." The cookie tin clattered to the floor. Tony quickly started picking up scattered cookies, but Leo sat frozen. "Who's Rebecca?" Tony asked. "My ex-girlfriend." Leo's voice was tight. "From before, everything." Martha reached for his hand. "She's been asking about you. Ever since the news about Davidson broke, she's been calling." "The house." Leo stood abruptly. "I need some air." He practically ran to the garden, his safe space. But today even the growing tomato plants couldn't calm his racing heart. Rebecca. The last person he'd hurt before walking away from his old life. The girl he'd loved since high school. The one he'd pushed away when she tried to stop him from leaving. "Want to talk about it?" He turned to see Sarah standing there, pink hair glowing in the sunset. "How do you always know when to show up?" She sat beside him on their usual bench. "Part of my job. Plus, Martha called me. Rebecca's been asking about me." "I know." Sarah watched him carefully. "How does that make you feel?" Leo opened his journal, flipping to an entry from 5 years ago. "Rebecca tried to stop me from leaving today. Said she loved me, that we could figure things out together. I told her love wasn't enough, that she was just another chain trying to hold me back. The look in her eyes when I said that, I'll never forget it." Sarah waited patiently as he turned to a newer page. "The worst part of getting clean isn't the physical pain. It's remembering all the people you hurt, all the bridges you burned. Some can be rebuilt, like with Dad. Others—" His voice broke. "You can't change the past," Sarah said gently, "but you can choose how to handle the present. I don't know if I'm strong enough to face her. 2 months ago, you weren't strong enough to face yourself." She gestured at the garden. "Look how far you've come." Inside, Martha was still sitting with Tony, showing him photos on her phone. There was Leo at his debate championship," she said proudly. "And this one, his 16th birthday. He looks so different," Tony marveled. "Happy? He was." Martha's voice caught. "Until he wasn't." Grayson arrived then, earlier than his usual evening visit. "Martha, did you tell him?" She nodded. "He's in the garden with Sarah." Grayson found them still sitting on the bench, Leo clutching his journal. "Like a shield." "Son, did you know?" Leo asked without looking up. "About Rebecca asking for me. She came to my office last week." Grayson sat on Leo's other side. "She saw the news about Davidson. Wanted to know if you were okay." "What did you tell her?" "The truth. That you're getting better. That you're doing the hard work of healing." Grayson paused. "She cried when I told her about finding you behind the dumpster." Leo closed his eyes. "I can't see her, Dad. Not yet. No one's asking you to." "But—" Grayson pulled an envelope from his pocket. "She wrote you this. You don't have to read it now or ever. It's your choice." Choice, such a simple word, but it meant everything to Leo now. He took the envelope with trembling hands. Rebecca's familiar handwriting on the front brought back a flood of memories. Their first date, study sessions in the mansion's library, her trying to talk sense into him that last night. "I was so cruel to her," he whispered. "You were angry and hurting," Sarah reminded him, "but you're not that person anymore." Leo tucked the letter into his journal. "I'll read it. Just not Today. That evening, after Martha left, leaving the cookie tin behind despite the rules about outside food, Leo sat with Tony in their room. "So," Tony said, munching a cookie, "the famous Rebecca, huh?" "Yeah. You gonna read the letter?" Leo touched his journal where the envelope lay hidden between its pages. "Eventually, when I'm stronger." "You're stronger than you think, rich boy." Tony tossed him a cookie. "But it's okay to take your time." Later, during his evening visit, Grayson found Leo back in the garden, writing. "New journal entry?" Leo nodded. "About Rebecca, about choices, about how sometimes the hardest person to forgive is yourself." Grayson sat quietly, letting his son write. The garden lights came on, casting long shadows across the vegetable beds. "Dad? Did you ever—" Leo hesitated. "After Mom died, did you ever let yourself love again?" Grayson's breath caught. They rarely talked about Leo's mother who died when he was just 4. "No," he said finally. "I threw myself into work instead, into making money. Thought if I could just be successful enough, rich enough, it would fill the hole she left." He looked at his son. "I was wrong. Is that why you pushed me so hard? To be successful? I think I was trying to protect you the only way I knew how. By making you strong, independent, financially secure." Grayson's voice cracked. "I didn't realize I was pushing you away instead." Leo wrote something in his journal, then showed it to his father. "Today I learned that sometimes strength isn't about pushing people away. Sometimes it's about letting them back in." "You really have become a writer," Grayson said softly. "Yeah, well," Leo managed a small smile. "Turns out emotional trauma is good for creativity." They sat together as night fell, father and son, surrounded by growing things. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The letter waited to be read. Rebecca's questions waited to be answered. The long road of recovery stretched ahead. But tonight, in this garden, they had cookies from Martha, words in a journal, and each other. Sometimes that's enough, because healing isn't just about getting clean or making amends. It's about learning to trust again, learning to love again, learning to hope again, one page, one day, one choice at a time. 3 months into Leo's stay at New Hope, Dr. Rodriguez called a special meeting with him and Grayson. "Leo's made exceptional progress," she said, smiling at them both. "We think it's time to discuss his discharge plan." The word discharge hit Leo like a physical blow. "Already?" "You're ready," Dr. Rodriguez assured him. "You're 3 months clean, actively participating in therapy, and your latest assessments show remarkable improvement." "But—" Leo looked at his father, then back at the doctor. "Where would I go?" "Home," Grayson said immediately. "Your room is exactly as you left it." Leo twisted his hands in his lap. "I don't know if I can. That house, there are too many memories." "Then we'll make new ones." Grayson leaned forward. "I've been thinking about this. The guest house by the pool, it's practically a separate home. You could have your own space, your privacy, but still be close." Dr. Rodriguez nodded approvingly. Having independence while maintaining support is crucial for recovery, but Leo was already shaking his head. "What about the press? They'll be all over this." "Actually," Grayson smiled, "they're rather distracted right now. The Davidson Tech scandal is still making headlines, and the New Hope Foundation's launch is getting a lot of positive attention." Leo looked up sharply. "The what? Remember that educational foundation I mentioned? For addiction survivors?" Grayson's eyes softened. "It's official now. We're already getting applications. People who want to go back to school, start over. Like me?" Leo's voice was barely a whisper. "If that's what you want." Grayson pulled out a familiar brochure, the creative writing program they'd discussed. No pressure, no expectations, just options. Dr. Rodriguez watched their exchange with satisfaction. "Leo, why don't you take some time to think about it? Talk it over with your support system here?" Later in the garden, Leo found Tony tending their tomato plants. They were full of green fruit now, almost ready to harvest. "So," Tony said without looking up. "Going home, huh?" "Maybe." Leo sat on their bench. "Scared to death, though." "That's normal." Tony finally turned to face him. "But you're not the same person who left that house 5 years ago, and neither is your dad. What if I relapse? What if you don't? Tony crossed his arms. Look, rich boy, I've seen a lot of people come through here. The ones who make it, they're the ones who let themselves believe in second chances. Leo pulled out his journal and Rebecca's still unopened letter. Speaking of second chances, you still haven't read it. Been waiting for the right time. Leo stared at the envelope. Maybe it's now. Tony squeezed his shoulder and walked away, giving him privacy. With trembling fingers, Leo opened the letter. Dear Leo, I've written this letter 100 times in my head over the past 5 years. Some versions were angry, others sad. But seeing the news about what Davidson did to you, learning where you've been, what you've been through, all I feel now is grateful. Grateful you survived, grateful you're getting help. I'm not writing to ask for anything. I just want you to know that the boy I loved, the kind, passionate, brave boy who wanted to write stories and change the world, I never stopped believing in him, even when you pushed me away, even when you lost belief in yourself. I'm proud of you for fighting your way back, for doing the hard work of healing. Whatever happens next, know that someone out there has always believed in you. Take care of yourself, Leo, Rebecca. Leo didn't realize he was crying until a tear splashed onto the paper. He quickly wiped his eyes, but more tears came. Hard letter? He looked up to see Sarah standing there, pink hair catching the evening light. She doesn't hate me, his voice cracked. After everything I did, she still... Love doesn't die easily. Sarah sat beside him, even when it should. I don't deserve her forgiveness. Forgiveness isn't about deserving. Sarah took the letter gently. It's about healing, both for the forgiver and the forgiven. That evening, when Grayson arrived for his daily visit, he found Leo in Dr. Rodriguez's office. I'll do it, Leo said as soon as his father walked in. The guest house, the writing program, all of it. Dr. Rodriguez beamed. I think that's a wonderful decision. But I have conditions, Leo continued. I need to keep coming here for outpatient therapy. And I want to volunteer at the shelter where Sarah works. Give back somehow. Of course, Grayson agreed immediately. Whatever you need. And Leo took a deep breath. I want to write my story, the real story, about Davidson, about addiction, about recovery. Maybe it could help someone else. The New Hope Foundation could publish it, Grayson suggested. If you want. Leo nodded, then pulled out Rebecca's letter. I need to respond to this too, not to try to get her back or anything, just to thank her for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself. That night, in their room, Tony helped Leo pack his few belongings. The journal, now nearly full, Martha's cookie tin, pictures from his time at New Hope. Gonna miss you, rich boy. Tony's gruff voice held unexpected emotion. Who's gonna help me with these tomatoes? I'll visit. Leo hugged his roommate. Someone has to make sure you don't kill our plants. As he packed, Leo found the photo Martha had brought. Him at 16, holding his debate trophy, smiling at a future he couldn't see. You know what's weird? He said to Tony. I thought coming here was the end of my story, rock bottom, but maybe it was just the beginning. Tony nodded wisely. That's the thing about rock bottom. Only place to go is up. The next morning, Leo stood in the garden one last time. The sun was rising, painting the sky in shades of hope. He opened his journal to write one final entry as a resident of New Hope. 5 years ago, I walked away from everything I knew, thinking I was choosing freedom. Instead, I found a different kind of prison. But here's what I've learned. Sometimes you have to lose everything to find what really matters. Sometimes the longest journey isn't the one that takes you away from home, but the one that brings you back. Tomorrow, I'll wake up in the guest house by the pool. I'll go to therapy, work on my book, maybe plant a new garden. And for the first time in 5 years, I won't be running away. I'll be walking towards something instead, second chances, new dreams, home. Not the home I left, but maybe a better one. Because this time, I'm not just the son he left behind, I'm the son who found his way back. And that makes all the difference. In the driveway, Grayson waited by the car. No driver today, just a father, ready to take his son home. Leo stood, tucking his journal under his arm. It was time to write a new chapter. Together, 6 months after leaving New Hope, Leo stood at the podium in the Pierce Enterprises conference room. The space was packed with reporters, business leaders, and most importantly, faces he'd come to know from the shelter and recovery community. "My name is Leo Pierce," he began, his voice steady, despite his racing heart. "And this is my story." In the front row, Grayson sat between Martha and Sarah, both dabbing at their eyes. Tony, on leave from New Hope, gave Leo a thumbs up from his seat. "5 years ago, I was an angry teenager who thought he had all the answers. Today, I stand before you as proof that it's never too late to start over." He opened his new journal, a leather-bound gift from his father, and began to read from his book, The Way Back Home. The story poured out. Not just his story, but the stories of all those Davidson had hurt, the brave ones who'd come forward, the ones who hadn't survived, the families still healing. "But this isn't just about what Michael Davidson did," Leo continued. "It's about addiction, about mental health, about the things we don't talk about in boardrooms and charity galas." He looked at his father, drawing strength from his proud smile. "That's why the New Hope Foundation isn't just about sending people back to school. It's about breaking the silence, breaking the stigma, letting people know they're not alone." The room erupted in applause when he finished. As cameras flashed, Leo caught a glimpse of someone slipping in at the back of the room, Rebecca. She looked exactly as he remembered, though her hair was shorter now. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and she gave him a small smile. Later, at the reception, she found him by the window. "That was quite a speech," she said softly. "Thanks for coming." Leo's heart raced, but not from fear this time. "And thank you for your letter. It meant a lot." "I meant every word." She studied his face. "You look good, Leo, healthy." "I'm getting there." He gestured to the room, the foundation banner, the crowd of people. "This helps, having a purpose. You always wanted to change the world." Her smile was gentle. "Just not the way your father planned." Speaking of plans, Leo took a deep breath. "I'm starting the creative writing program next semester, finally going after that old dream." "I know." At his surprised look, she laughed. "I teach there now, literature and composition." "You're kidding." "Nope. Looks like you'll be seeing a lot of me, Mr. Pierce." Before Leo could respond, Tony appeared with a plate of appetizers. "These fancy snacks are amazing," he announced. "Oh, sorry, am I interrupting?" "No," Leo smiled. "Rebecca, this is Tony. He kept me sane at New Hope. And helped me grow tomatoes." "The famous Tony," Rebecca shook his hand. "Leo wrote about you in his book." "All good things, I hope." Tony winked. "Speaking of tomatoes, rich boy, you need to come visit. Our garden's gone crazy. We're feeding the whole center now." Across the room, Grayson was deep in conversation with Dr. Rodriguez, who'd come to support Leo's big day. "He's doing remarkably well," she was saying. "The foundation work, his writing, staying connected to the recovery community. It's exactly what he needs." "And the guest house?" "Perfect balance of independence and support." She smiled. "Though I hear he has dinner with his father every night." "Not every night," Grayson protested. "Sometimes we have breakfast instead." Martha joined them, beaming with pride. "Did you see him up there? Our boy helping others." She wiped her eyes. "And Rebecca came." "I saw." Grayson watched his son talking with his old girlfriend, noticing how his eyes lit up when she laughed. Some things never changed. Sarah appeared with champagne glasses filled with sparkling cider. "A toast," she announced, "to new beginnings." "To family," Martha added. "To healing," Dr. Rodriguez smiled. "To my son," Grayson said softly, who found his way home. Later that night, Leo sat in his study in the guest house, surrounded by photos, him and Tony in the New Hope Garden. The foundation's first scholarship, recipients, his father teaching a business class at the shelter, and now a new one from today. Leo at the podium sharing his story, his father beaming in the front row. He opened his journal and began to write, "Today, I stood in front of the world and told my truth. Not the sanitized version for the society pages, not the tragic headline version, the real truth with all its mess and pain and hope. 5 years ago, I was lost. 3 years ago, I was homeless. 6 months ago, I was in rehab. Today, I'm a son, a friend, a writer, a survivor. Tomorrow, I'll be a student again, chasing dreams I thought I'd lost. And somewhere between the boy who ran away and the man I'm becoming, I found something I never expected. I found myself. Not in spite of my father's money or name, but beyond it. Not in spite of my mistakes, but because of what they taught me. Rebecca said she never stopped believing in me. The truth is, I had to learn to believe in myself again. And somehow along the way, I learned to believe in my father too. We're not perfect. Some days are harder than others. Sometimes the cravings hit, and I have to call Tony, or go to a meeting, or just sit in my new garden until they pass. But that's okay. Because life isn't about being perfect. It's about being real. It's about second chances and fresh starts and the courage to begin again. It's about knowing that no matter how far you run, home is always waiting. You just have to be brave enough to come back. Hands strong enough to stay. A knock at his door interrupted his writing. Grayson stood there holding 2 cups of Martha's hot chocolate. "Thought you might need this after today," he said, handing Leo a mug. "Thanks, Dad." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the pool lights shimmer in the darkness. "You know," Grayson said finally, "I always thought I had to choose between being a good businessman and being a good father. And now I know the truth." He smiled at his son. "The best investment I ever made wasn't in stocks or buildings. Let me guess, it was in me?" Leo rolled his eyes, but he was smiling too. "No." Grayson's voice was soft. "It was in us." Leo understood. In the space between father and son, in the bridges they'd rebuilt, in the love that had survived anger and addiction and loss. In second chances, in coming home, in beginning again together,